For decades, society has treated the idea of overcoming trauma as a psychological necessity. Popular culture, mainstream therapy, and even the advice of well-meaning friends often follow a simple formula. Let go of the past, forget, move on. Yet what if this very mindset, instead of liberating us, actually keeps us imprisoned? What if the insistence on erasing pain is the very reason suffering endures? Carl Jung, one of the most influential figures in depth psychology, argued that this common approach is not only inadequate, but potentially harmful. To Jung, trauma doesn't vanish when ignored. It fragments, divides, and continues to operate beneath the conscious mind. Like a silent infection, it seeps into our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors, shaping our actions without our awareness. When left unacknowledged, trauma evolves into what Jung described as an autonomous, complex, and independent psychic entity with its own will, emotions, and motives that often conflict with our conscious intentions. These complexes don't die in repression. They thrive in darkness. They emerge in moments of crisis, in patterns of self-sabotage, in recurring emotional wounds that seem to replay endlessly, as if something deep within us is determined to relive the same pain over and over again. Jung noticed that many people trapped in trauma unconsciously form an identity around their pain. It's a subtle psychological imprisonment where the self becomes the trauma itself. Healing then begins to feel like a threat, because it means losing the only identity one has come to know. While conventional psychology often aims to suppress symptoms or erase distressing memories, Jung proposed a far more daring and transformative path. He encouraged us not to forget trauma, but to journey into it, to face it, understand it, reclaim the parts of ourselves that were lost, and ultimately integrate the experience into our wholeness. From this perspective, trauma is not a mistake to be deleted, but an experience that seeks meaning, not to justify suffering, but to transmute it into wisdom, resilience, and expanded consciousness. In this video, we'll explore Jung's groundbreaking understanding of trauma. You'll discover why he believed that genuine healing doesn't arise from forgetting, but from symbolic integration, a profound, inner, and deeply human process. And if you carry wounds that never seem to heal, patterns that repeat without reason, or a lingering sense of inner fragmentation, then this video is meant for you. Because perhaps what you truly need is not to overcome your trauma, but to finally become whole. Many people believe that healing from trauma means forgetting it, erasing the memories, controlling the triggers, and eliminating the pain. This belief has become so common that it now functions almost like a modern-day dogma. If you still feel hurt, if the memories still ache, it's often assumed that you failed to heal. But this idea that healing equals the absence of suffering is an illusion. And according to Carl Jung, it's not just mistaken, it's dangerous. In conventional psychology, trauma is often viewed as a kind of foreign object lodged in the psyche, something to be processed until it can be expelled. Jung, however, saw it completely differently. To him, trauma is not an external invader that can be extracted like a tumor. It penetrates the deepest layers of the psyche, and when it remains unrecognized and unintegrated, it doesn't vanish, it transforms. Specifically, it becomes what Jung called autonomous complexes. These complexes are dissociated fragments of the personality that split off from consciousness and begin to operate independently, almost like living psychic entities. They form when the ego, overwhelmed by the emotional intensity of an experience, isolates that experience from the rest of the psyche. Yet what is isolated is not destroyed. It simply takes on its own existence, functioning on the outskirts of awareness. And that's where the true problem begins. An autonomous complex can be triggered by any stimulus that symbolically echoes the original trauma. A certain phrase, a tone of voice, a familiar sensation in the body. Suddenly, the person finds themselves reacting with rage, panic, or paralysis without understanding why. It isn't logical. It isn't conscious. It's the complex taking over. Jung noticed that in such moments, it's as if the personality is hijacked. The person isn't responding to the present, they're reliving an unresolved past that continues to assert itself. This mechanism explains countless irrational behaviors, intense anger that feels uncontrollable, overwhelming fear in safe situations, or destructive cycles in relationships. And the cruel irony is that the more we try to forget the trauma, the stronger it becomes in the unconscious. What we refuse to face consciously returns as fate. Simply moving on doesn't heal, it actually nourishes the very wound we're trying to escape. It's like trying to treat a deep infection by covering it with makeup. The surface may look improved, but the sickness grows beneath. Real healing demands that we descend to the root of our pain, confront what we've avoided, and bring light to what has been buried in darkness. But how does such transformation occur? How can the unconscious be integrated rather than suppressed? And what exactly are these complexes that seem to possess a will of their own? In the next segment, we'll explore more deeply the nature of these autonomous complexes, the psychic entities Jung described, which may already be silently influencing your life. If this content resonates with you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. Carl Jung was among the first to recognize that the human psyche is not a single, unified whole. It is composed of multiple parts, some conscious, many others hidden deep within the unconscious. When these inner parts are shaped by unresolved and unintegrated traumatic experiences, they acquire such powerful emotional energy that they begin to function independently. Jung referred to these formations as autonomous complexes. But what exactly are these complexes? In simple terms, a complex is a psychic nucleus formed around a deeply charged emotional memory, often one of pain, fear, shame, or humiliation, that has been separated from the conscious ego, once excluded from a person's conscious story. This emotional content fragments and develops a kind of autonomy, not literally alive, of course, but psychologically active, behaving as if it were a separate inner being with its own motives, reasoning, and will. These complexes are behind many of our irrational and disproportionate emotional reactions. A small comment provokes overwhelming anger. A simple compliment sparks anxiety, guilt, or discomfort. A healthy relationship is suddenly sabotaged without explanation. These are not conscious decisions, they are activations of complexes. It's the past breaking into the present. What's even more unsettling is that these complexes don't just act in isolated moments. Over time, they shape consistent behavior patterns, rigid beliefs, and even entire dimensions of identity. Many people live most of their lives unconsciously driven by these complexes, repeating automatic cycles like rituals, each one attempting to resolve an old wound. But without awareness, they cannot heal. They can only reenact the pain. Jung observed that unintegrated trauma tends to express itself in cycles. A person may continually attract circumstances or relationships that echo their original wound. A pattern of abuse, for instance, may repeat with different faces and settings, because the unconscious is trying to heal. Yet without awareness, the psyche merely relives the pain instead of resolving it. The mind seeks closure but finds repetition, and here lies a crucial insight. The unconscious is not trying to punish you, it's trying to finish an unfinished story. But when trauma is not faced with clarity and courage, the same script replays endlessly, and with every repetition, the wound grows deeper. There is, however, something even more subtle and devastating. Over time, a complex can become so dominant that it merges with one's sense of self. The person begins to believe, this is who I am. The victim becomes their suffering. The rejected becomes the rejection. The abused becomes the fragile self. And any attempt at change feels like a threat to existence, because if the pain disappears, what remains? Who am I without this story? This is the trap of identification with the victim, a psychological snare. Jung identified as one of the greatest obstacles to genuine healing. In the next part, we'll explore this dynamic in greater depth, how trauma infiltrates identity, why we unconsciously resist healing, and and how the narrative of pain can quietly evolve into an invisible prison. Among Carl Jung's most profound and unsettling insights is the recognition that trauma doesn't just leave scars on the psyche, it can shape the very core of who we believe we are. Over time, pain stops being merely a memory. It becomes a mirror. And when we stare into that mirror for too long, we begin to mistake the reflection for our true self. We become the victim. This is what Jung described as identification with the complex. When a trauma is intense and remains unintegrated, it becomes the gravitational center of the psyche. Everything begins to revolve around that wound, our personal story, our worldview, our relationships, our behavior. Everything becomes filtered through the lens of suffering. And the most haunting part? It happens quietly, unconsciously, almost invisibly. Identification with the victim is not a conscious choice to suffer. It is not masochism. It is the psyche's instinctive attempt to preserve inner stability in the face of psychological collapse. In simple terms, if pain was the most defining experience of your life, if it was the only constant, then your unconscious will cling to it as an anchor. Without it, you may feel as though there is nothing left. No story, no identity, no self. That's why so many people unconsciously resist healing, not because they enjoy their suffering, but because they fear the emptiness that might follow. Who would you be without that trauma? Who would you be without the anger that shields you, the fear that guides you, the sadness that defines you? Pain may be unbearable, but the uncertainty of the unknown can feel even more terrifying. And so, we remain imprisoned within destructive patterns. We return to toxic relationships. We sabotage ourselves at crucial moments. We attract neglect, humiliation, and abandonment, not because we are weak or unaware, but because an unconscious part of us believes that this pain is all that remains of who we are. Jung understood these recurring behaviors as failed attempts at symbolic resolution. The unconscious mind is desperately trying to close the wound, but without awareness, it can only recreate the original situation, hoping, perhaps, for a different outcome each time. But the ending never changes until the story is consciously rewritten. This understanding transforms everything. It reveals that the true path to healing is not about forgetting or moving on, but about dissolving the identification with pain, rediscovering who you are beyond the trauma, and breaking free from the invisible prison you didn't even realize you were living in. But how is this transformation achieved? How can one undo years or even decades of unconscious identification? How do we separate what truly belongs to us from what was shaped by suffering? In the next part, we'll enter the core of Jung's healing process, the three essential stages that make confrontation, recovery, and integration possible, and explore why these vital steps are so often overlooked by conventional forms of therapy. Most modern therapeutic approaches focus on emotional regulation strategies, thought restructuring, and symptom control. They aim to restore the normal functioning of the ego to maintain surface-level balance. But Carl Jung saw trauma as something far deeper, something that could not be healed merely by calming the exterior. For him, true recovery required a descent, a deliberate journey into the darkest basements of the soul, where trauma resides and continues to operate unseen. This journey unfolds in three profound stages, which form the core of the Jungian approach to trauma healing: conscious confrontation, recovery of lost aspects, and symbolic integration. Stage 1. Conscious confrontation. The first stage requires something many instinctively avoid: looking directly at the wound, not with intellectual detachment, but with emotional presence. It involves revisiting the pain with open eyes, without dissociation, minimization, or rationalization. It is about being fully present, whole, and allowing oneself to experience anguish without attempting to erase it. Jung emphasized that repression is the greatest enemy of individuation because what is avoided always returns, often disguised, distorted, and more destructive than before. This confrontation is not merely reliving the trauma, it is bearing witness. Consciously, it is the moment when the ego, instead of fleeing or denying, confronts what was fragmented and begins to piece it together. It is the first step in the rescue of the self. Stage 2. Recovery of lost aspects. Trauma does not only strip peace or security, it fragments the self. It can kill a child's spontaneity, silence the voice of someone who once spoke boldly, and destroy trust, joy, and the ability to surrender to love. Jung referred to this as soul loss, essential fragments of the psyche that detach and hide in the unconscious, as a form of self-preservation. Therapeutic work at this stage resembles inner archaeology, digging to retrieve these lost parts, not only as memories but as living potentials needing reintegration into present life. It is insufficient to merely understand what was lost. These aspects must be revived, lived, and expressed to laugh again, to trust, to desire, to create, to reclaim the vitality frozen by trauma. Stage 3. Symbolic integration. The third stage, symbolic integration, is perhaps the most sophisticated. Its purpose is not to justify the trauma, but to give it meaning. Jung saw symbols as the language of the unconscious, a bridge between inner and outer worlds. When trauma is symbolized, it ceases to be purely destructive and becomes a portal for transformation. This is not romanticizing pain. It is acknowledging that suffering awakens qualities that might otherwise remain dormant: resilience, compassion, depth, clarity. The wound heals but leaves a mark. When understood symbolically, this mark becomes strength. Jung said we do not heal by denying darkness, but by illuminating it. Symbolic integration transforms destructive darkness into a guiding and teaching presence. These three stages, confrontation, recovery, integration, are not linear. They are spiral. Often the process requires revisiting the pain, uncovering forgotten aspects, and discovering new symbols. With each turn, the ego becomes stronger, more stable, and more aware. Eventually, trauma stops being the center of identity and becomes a scar that teaches. Pain does not vanish, but it is transcended. Many believe healing is about returning to a version of themselves that existed before trauma, as if a pure, intact self had been lost. Jung dismantled this illusion. True healing is not regressive. It is transformative. It is not about returning to an original self, but about becoming someone who would never have existed without that pain. The scar is not a flaw, it is a seal of evolution. When trauma is fully integrated, it loses its parasitic power. It does not disappear, but it stops hijacking your identity. Instead of dictating your reactions, it becomes understood memory. You still remember the pain, but it no longer decides for you. This marks a crucial moment, the replacement of reactive conditioning with conscious presence. You stop living on autopilot, reenacting old wounds, and begin choosing consciously how to respond to life. Jung described this state as the integration of the personal unconscious into the self. Trauma, when symbolized, becomes part of a larger system of meaning. It aligns with your existential narrative and transforms into wisdom, not theoretical, academic or rational, but embodied wisdom, born from surviving the unbearable and emerging with clarity, strength, and compassion. This transformation does not happen through ready-made formulas or denial. It requires courage to cross into the depths of one's own psyche. At the end of this crossing, what emerges is not a corrected self, but a new, more whole, more profound psychic entity. Trauma ceases to be a curse and becomes a turning point, revealing your oldest wounds, the parts that needed rescuing, and the strengths that only emerge in darkness. The scar is symbolic. It tells a story, but it is a story you can narrate, not one that controls you. The wound may bleed and paralyze, but the scar guides and teaches. Healing, for Jung, is alchemy, the lead of suffering transformed into the gold of consciousness. Living consciously after trauma integration does not mean living without pain. It means living without being enslaved by it. Old emotions may visit, but they knock on the door rather than invading your home uninvited. You now have a choice: to welcome them with maturity, understand their origin and respond consciously. This is individuation, becoming whole, even with cracks. Wholeness is not perfection. It is recognizing your darkest parts without shame. It is saying, yes, this happened to me, but it does not define me. It is living with compassion for yourself and others, knowing what it means to carry the unbearable and to move forward anyway. The scar remains, it always will, but now it does not bleed. It shines. If you've followed this far, you may recognize yourself in the journey. You may see patterns that now make sense, and perhaps feel a quiet call to confront yourself with honesty and courage. Comment below, which part of this journey resonated most with your story? What truths have you been avoiding? I read the comments and want to know how this content impacted you. If this video resonated with you, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss upcoming content.